The broad fantasy of the American dream was a goal that many immigrants from overseas tried to achieve. From the very beginnings of America's foundation, the country stood for freedom and equality for those deciding to settle. David Ellison, a retired history teacher, gives us insight into this notion.
The American dream, historically, and I'm not speaking for myself, would be embodied by the Statue of Liberty.
Okay.
And it was in some ways, an international acknowledgement on the part of France of American exceptionalism, that there was something here that people looked to, admired, and they wanted to come here and become a part of it. And obviously the Statue of Liberty implies one of our the greatest things about the American dream was just our democratic form of government. The fact that all citizens, regardless of socioeconomic status, had a vote and had rights. I think our Bill of Rights was something truly unique, which I have to add is why I'm so terrified today, because it seems to be being systematically destroyed.
The notion of American exceptionalism is a term in which America's values, political system, and history are unique and worthy of universal acknowledgement. America was seen as an up-and-coming nation that showcased modern values. The Statue of Liberty, which represents a universal symbol of freedom, shows the principles that America was presenting to the world. As many flocked to become the new rags to riches story, there were figures rising in America's growing public appearance. Andrew Carnegie, an American industrialist who amassed a fortune in the steel industry, had created a corporation called Carnegie Steel, which was worth $40 million. In addition to Carnegie, there was Henry Ford, an American industrialist who revolutionized factory production with his assembly line methods. Ford became regarded as the symbol of transition from agricultural to industrial America and had a net worth of $200 billion. In 1903, he established the Ford Motor Company, and 5 years later, that company rolled out the first Model T. In order to meet the overwhelming demands for the revolutionary vehicle, Ford introduced revolutionary new mass production methods, including large production plants, the use of standardized interchangeable parts, and in 1913, the world's first moving assembly line for cars. These two figures in history were the beginnings of the new industrialized America. With an increase in wealth and room for many more wealthy Americans, America's economy had begun to grow. However, there was also an increase in the wealth gap between the rich and the poor, and with the rise in the Great Depression, this gap only grew. The nation's wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and the economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent yet unfamiliar consumer society. From the Great Depression in the 1930s through the late 1970s, there was a substantial democratization of wealth. Then the trend inverted, with the total share of household wealth of the top 0.1% increasing to 22% in 2012 from the 7% in the late 1970s. Following the democratization of wealth, the gap continued to increase. The negative outcomes finally started to take root with the 2008 financial crisis, which was the worst recession since the Great Depression. The 2008 financial crisis in America had led to America's GDP declining by 4.3% and the unemployment rate approaching 10%. These effects in America still stand true today, where American families are stuck in an endless cycle of debt from losing their houses and being unable to afford health benefits. Communities that are susceptible to such issues the most are people from the age groups 18 to 35, African American communities, and lower wage workers. When the 2008 financial crisis had hit, the economy started to show signs of weakness. However, for billionaires, they didn't face adversities that a common American did in the early 2000s. That's because billionaires triumph in the global economy. Looking at companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Coca-Cola, they seem to be doing well. That's because these companies use technology to their advantage. As the financial crisis continued in 2008 and continues till this day, we've noticed that these companies seem to be doing well, while millions of Americans lose their jobs. This is because when you have technology that is efficient at mass producing and doesn't require human attention, compared with the global recession going on, where many are already losing their jobs, it leads to a deep recession where people will be unable to get jobs for a very long time. Companies had learned during the 2008 financial crisis that they were able to take out thousands of employees and still generate the same amount of money in profit. The reason why America still looks towards foreign investment is because companies on the S&P 500 had realized that they were generating 46% of their profits overseas. And for many of the biggest American names, this proportion can be even higher. These corporations are also turning to labor outside of America because of quality work at a lower price. This has led to a lot of job cuts at home, where demand is weakening. It also partially explains why the hope for many immigrants trying to find labor in America is becoming increasingly harder as big companies turn to cheaper labor. None of these American companies will ever give up on the American market. It is too large, too profitable, and too central to their businesses. But the marginal dollar is more likely to be used overseas than in America. Labor isn't the only industry susceptible to job loss, but even tech jobs for engineers and STEM majors trying to immigrate to America are willing to work at a lower cost for many big tech firms. Businesses have a way to navigate this new world of technological change and globalization. The ordinary American worker does not. It's a country with one of the highest wages in the world because it is one of the richest countries in the world. That makes it harder for the average American middle-class worker to benefit from technology and global growth the same way that these companies do. The distinction in the future won't be between the highly educated workers and those that are less educated, but rather between jobs that can be done overseas and those that cannot. David Otter, an MIT economist, has done an important study on what he calls the polarization of job opportunities in America. Otter finds that job growth divides neatly into three categories. On one side are managerial, professional, and technical occupations, held by highly educated workers who are comfortable in the global economy. Jobs have been plentiful in this segment for the past 3 decades. On the other hand are service occupations, those that involve helping, caring for, or assisting others, such as security guard, cook, and waiter. Most of these jobs have no college education and can get hourly rates that are on the low end of the scale. Jobs in this segment, too, have been growing robustly. In between are the skilled manual workers and those in white-collar operations like sales and office management. These jobs represent the beating heart of the middle class. Those in them make a decent living, usually above the median family income, and mostly did fine in the 2 decades before 2000. And since then, the employment growth has lagged the economy in general. And these middle-class folks have been hammered. It seems that technology followed by global competition has played the largest role in making the middle-class worker seem less valuable. It is not news to anyone that corporations are using their wealth to ensure that the government operates under their best interests since the Industrial Revolution. A few examples of situations like these are as follows. 1. Enron was a tireless advocate of strict global energy regulations supported by environmentalists. Enron also used its influence in Washington to keep laissez-faire bureaucrats off the federal commissions that regulate the energy industry. Philip Morris had aggressively supported the heightened federal regulation of tobacco and tobacco advertising. Meanwhile, the state governments that sued Big Tobacco are now working to protect those same large cigarette companies from competition and lawsuits. 3. A recent tax increase in Virginia passed because of the tireless support of the state's business leaders, and big businesses have a long history of supporting tax hikes. However, governmental and corporation affiliation isn't the only issue. Income inequality doesn't just sprout out of nowhere. It stems from many different economic factors, one of them being generational wealth. The 15 family dynasties in the US own a combined $618 billion. Since 1982, the combined wealth of the top 3 families increased by 5,868%. Billionaires like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett plan on combating generational wealth by pouring their money into the Giving Pledge instead of giving it to their families. In fact, Buffett himself stated that dynastic wealth, the enemy of meritocracy, is on the rise, while equality of opportunity is on the decline. Starting from the early 20th century, millions of immigrants believed that the American dream would provide them with the wealth and stability that their home countries couldn't provide them with. In the beginning of this mass migration post the industrial boom, most of the immigrant population was of European descent, with the exclusion of Chinese laborers, of course. The change in the demographic came with the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. This enabled people like Ravinder to come to the United States. The American dream had finally become accomplished.
I had seen a lot of my neighbors moving abroad. My own family was moving to the UK, Australia, Canada and US. We heard about the nice thing and that the lifestyle was better. Many parents wanted their children to get better education and wanted to earn the American dollar. We decided to move for a better future for our children and ourselves.
Ravinder was right. For immigrants in Asia, the American dream seems appealing for the stability that it brought back in its day. The American dream for immigrants now, however, seems entirely unattainable. The premise of the American dream was simple. Once you immigrated to the United States, you and your family would be guaranteed a house and a job. After the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, there was a shift. Under the old immigration systems established in the 1920s, the admissions of immigrants was solely based on country of origin, which prioritized Northern and Western Europeans. When the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act had passed, it put people of all nations on an equal footing for immigration to the United States. The new legislation judged immigrants based on individual merit rather than race or national origin, which increased immigrants from Asia and Africa who were traditionally discriminated. The downside of this was that as immigration increased, many immigrants became subjected to low-paying jobs. The reason for this was because of supply and demand. As immigrants increased in America in a desperate attempt to start a new life, many were willing to do labor at a lower cost than natives already established. Low-wage jobs have an insufficient supply, which is why wages never increase because of the demand being relative to the supply. While America's economy had produced a net benefit of $50 billion in profit from legal and illegal immigrants in 2010, many are still overworked and underpaid and face several challenges. They are equal on paper, but not in the minds of Americans. Hate crimes increase exponentially, with immigrants finding it harder to find and complete everyday jobs that other Americans found at ease. While it is illegal to discriminate someone based on race, creed, or class, employers always found a way of deeming people of color unqualified. This meant that along with the language barrier, people of color had to work much harder than the average American to fulfill their American dream of owning a house and living a peaceful life. In addition, Indigenous and African Americans, those who had been oppressed for centuries under America, had found themselves systematically oppressed. One example of this being mass incarceration. Ever since the abolishment of slavery, African Americans had been thrown into prison for petty crimes in order to complete the need for labor. The 13th Amendment itself states that slavery is abolished, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. The Constitution allowed for a legal loophole for the continuation of slavery, and for African American populations, they had to deal with the outcomes of poverty and over-policing, which put them at a legal disadvantage. For this population, the American dream was nothing but a facade. Due to the over-policing in minority neighborhoods and the increased chance of being charged higher for a crime than the white population in America, there are still signs of systematic oppression present in our society. Countless studies show how minorities that widened their resumes were more likely to get a callback from employers, only proving the growing income inequality present for minorities trying to make a living in America. On the other hand, the Native American dream was non-existent. Native Americans were placed on reservations throughout their entire history, forcing them to conform to American religions and ideals. For Native Americans, their American dream wasn't to build a home and have a subtle, happy life. Their version of the American dream was to sustain their religion and way of living. Even to this day, sacred Native American land is spoiled by monuments, pipelines, and capitalist ventures. The increased participation of the U.S. government in helping exploit native lands is becoming a growing concern. There have been findings that the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is tasked for finding the best negotiating prices for Indian landowners, has actually made it easier for outside corporations to exploit native land. As a result, these corporations have been able to drill, frack, farm, and fell native land while giving landowners little in return.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm a child of immigrant parents. I'm first generation, so my parents came from a country that wasn't great for them, that was in a lot of turmoil, that was a third world country, um, you know, poverty, all that stuff. So obviously they came here seeking opportunity. So that was what they wanted. And I think education was a big part of that dream for them both, which unfortunately they weren't able to really achieve on their own. So when they met and married and had kids, that was like a big dream for themselves. So I feel like the American dream for me has always been what my parents, you know, like my ancestors, my lineage, my heritage, what they kind of sacrificed to be in this country and all of the hardships that they face. Um, you know, that's kind of been on my back for determining what makes me successful. And I think a big part of that has always been education. Like there's always been a big focus on education, to go to school, to go to college, to get degrees, things like that. And so I think now that I'm, you know, older and I've experienced life on my own and I'm an adult, um, I I think the American dream has very much shifted and changed. And I don't think that my parents really understood um, what they wanted and what that meant and why they came here in the first place. And I think that really changed for them too over time, when they realized that when they got here, things were really stagnant, things weren't changing, things were hard. And they thought of this place as America as something that was going to give them so much more than it actually did. So it's always evolving, it's always changing, and I don't think it really exists anymore for us, our family, for people like us. So it's more about just surviving now. That's kind of what it's changed to.
So, like, I know growing up, it was like a really big thing that if you went to college, it would be really, really easy for you to just get a job. So, do you think that perception is becoming more and more misleading as time goes on?
Um, yes. Yes and no, but mostly yes. So I think that there's this huge push and pressure in terms of like societal views, in terms of our culture as a nation, and even microcultures within different multicultural groups, that there are certain types of jobs that deem you successful. And those jobs usually are the ones that make more money. And those jobs are usually, because they make more money, I guess you have to put more money into your education to get those jobs. And so I think it's misleading, because I have seen now and I have witnessed people be super successful without education, in terms of traditional education from a 4-year like university, getting a bachelor's degree or beyond, right? I've seen people do different trades and gone to trade school and do, you know, labor and service work that has made them very successful, has made their life really rewarding and fulfilled. That isn't necessarily what a lot of people deem as successful, just because they're not in certain roles or jobs. And so yeah, I don't think that you have to go to school to be successful at all. I think that everybody can take their own path. There's entrepreneurs, there's people who are kind of self-directed, that can make things work for themselves, that they don't need to go to school necessarily to learn those things. They can teach themselves, that they're really good at it. And they kind of can learn by doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent. Like, I think of my own educational experience, and I think like, well, I feel like the first 2 years where it was like incredibly social for me, and I loved meeting friends and being a part of the school culture, like I wish I would have gone to community college, right? I wish I would have done community college, paid less money, be less in debt, and then transferred to a 4-year university to get my bachelor's degree, because it would have saved me a lot of financial strain now in adulthood. But at the time, it was this big thing that you had to go to college if you wanted to be successful. You had to go to college if you wanted to be deemed somebody of worth. And I think the culture is changing. I think a lot of people would agree that it's slowly changing, and that we're realizing more and more now that you don't necessarily need to go that one route, that there are multiple routes to be successful.
So do you think that if, let's say, like, college became less expensive, do you think that more people now would choose to go to a 4-year college rather than like go to some other school?
Absolutely. 100%. I think that if college was affordable, if colleges was on a sliding scale based on need or income, if college was free for people who lived in the United States, I absolutely think that people would take advantage of that, just for the reasons, mentioned, that we live in a society that values degrees, but we also live in a society where there's systemic challenges where not everybody has the same opportunities and equal access to those degrees, whether it be financial burdens, whether that be just their experiences in high school, whether that be like systematic racism or classism, whatever it could be. Sometimes it's even language, like people don't necessarily speak the dominant language of English as well as their first or their native born language. And so there's a lot of challenges that, are kind of barriers right now for people to go on to get their degrees at 4-year institutions. But I think if it was free, that would free up a lot of the challenges. Or if it was even just more cost efficient or cheaper.
There's a big push in our society to value an education and get a degree, but our education system makes it difficult for certain people to achieve their dreams. The race gaps on the SAT are especially pronounced on how racially biased our education system is. Among top scorers, 60% are Asian and 33% are white, compared to the 5% Latino and 2% Black. This data doesn't prove that some races are inherently smarter, but rather highlights the growing inequality in our system, where school districts with predominantly low-paying minority students are more likely to get less funding for their schools than their white counterparts. This gap only widens when we see that Black and Hispanic students are less likely to go to college. With society deeming those with college degrees and those that are lawyers, doctors, and engineers as the elite of jobs, it makes it hard for many who are unable to afford college. The cost of a 4-year college degree increased by 25%, and the student debt increased by 107%. Some 44 million Americans collectively hold over $1.6 trillion in student debt. And these numbers are growing. Justin isn't the only one who feels he won't be able to afford housing. About half of 18 to 34-year-olds said that a down payment is the single greatest financial barrier to home ownership. These growing concerns about their financial stability and the economy favoring the richest is starting to project on younger generations. Several previous generations were unaware of the hypocrisy of the American dream. Generation Z, however, has had access to the World Wide Web from a very early age. This has led to the generation being aware of what the future holds for them and what the American dream really means. After looking at the repercussion of hiding centuries of oppression and the erasure of the American dream, it is imperative that we dig deeper for a solution. There are many solutions, but it requires a change in not only how the government operates, but in relations to companies and personal lifestyle. Americans have been able to identify the source of this issue, but are unable to make any changes. So what is the solution? It's easier to identify the wrong one than the right one. You cannot shut down this new world. There are solutions, but they require hard and painful changes in companies, government programs, and personal lifestyle. For more than a generation, Americans have been unwilling to make these adjustments. Instead, we found an easier way to goose the economy by expanding consumption. Unfortunately, this rise in consumption was not triggered by a rise in income. Wages have been largely stagnant. It was facilitated rather by an increase in credit, so that now the average American family has no fewer than 13 credit cards. Household debt rose from $680 billion in 1974 to $14 trillion in 2008. This pattern repeated itself in government, except on a much larger scale. People everywhere, from California to New Jersey, wanted fewer taxes, but more government. Local, state, and federal governments obliged. It's becoming awfully clear that Bernie and other leftist ideologies are widely accepted in younger generations. The majority of Generation Z has grown up in a time of chaos and uncertainty in the country that they grew up to love, only to find out that it did not live up to their standards. This helps explain why progressive ideologies are becoming favorite contenders in younger generations. There is a way to fix this sense of unreliability by changing the narrative of capitalism. We need to focus our economy on maximizing human welfare. We need to be able to make good of the overall people as more valuable than the profits of the few. In a society where pharmaceutical companies can charge extortionate rates for a life-saving drug just because of the customer being desperate, we need to help shape and value companies that want to help bring a sense of community and reward those that value the well-being of all. Fundamentally, America needs to move from consumption to investment. Everyone agrees that the best way to create jobs in the US is to create a new industry, new companies, and to innovate within old ones. This means that we need large investments in research, technology, and development. As a society, we need to have this as our strongest focus. Most jobs that will have good future prospects will be complicated. Workers will need to be able to juggle data, symbols, and computer programs in some way or the other, no matter what the task. This means that workers will need to be educated and retrained. We need to make sure that workers are given education at every level, especially job retraining. So far, retraining efforts in the US have not been working well. We need stricter regulations on how we tax the extremely wealthy. With the top 0.1% of America making as much wealth as 90% of Americans, it's clear how our country has failed to provide the stability for the ordinary American. In addition, the ultra-wealthy are well known for evading their taxes, so implementing stronger enforcement policies is vital. The health and safety of our future is at risk. Corporations that back up policymakers to help block legislation only undermines the role that the government should play to help protect the people. There are many politicians who run off of donor dollars to help protect corporations instead of valuing the lives of the people. There's a duty of the US government to get corporate money out of politics and help put the safety of the people first. Without a doubt, we can see how systematic racism still exists till this day. It is important to grow our nation by first universally addressing that there are physical, political, legal, economic, and environmental types of violence waged against Black, Brown, and Indigenous Americans. By doing so, we will finally have a nation that is willing to make a change within our system. The fact that America imprisons a higher percentage of its citizens than almost any other country in the world, and minorities are disproportionately represented in this group, shows exactly how big systematic racism is. In addition, with our current judicial system, imprisonment follows someone for the rest of their lives. We have to understand and self-reflect that our country has failed the people by having tough on crime legislation, the war on drugs, and misguided laws over the years. Our focus should be to eliminate poverty and stop this racial divide in which there is over-policing in predominantly minority neighborhoods, while also allowing voting rights for felons, because the American criminal justice system should be built around the idea of rehabilitation and not to deprive someone else of their right to vote. With many students having to settle for low-paying jobs that they are overqualified for because of the immense pressure that they face with their growing debt, there is an obligation for a government to give quality higher education at a lower cost. This isn't even an idea unknown or foreign to many other first world countries, who already have free or significantly cheaper higher education. If we give the first 2 years of a college education for free or at a substantially lower cost, we'll be able to eliminate the debt that many students face and increase the amount of students going into college. With an expansion of programs that forgive the debt of graduates who work in rural areas or with the underprivileged populations, we also increase the importance of creating a welfare society that rewards those that work for the disadvantaged. In addition, Medicare for all is a necessity for the survival of our people, which is the right for all Americans should be entitled to because everyone's life deserves to be risk-free. These forces do look overwhelming, but these challenges have been beaten before and can be again.